Hey, welcome to Tony Palmeri's Media Rants, and I'm really thrilled today to be joined by one of the best independent journalists working in the state of Wisconsin today, and his name is Dan Shafer. He's the founder of the Recombobulation Area, which he started independently, I guess, in 2019, and now is part of Civic Media. Dan, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Always good to join a somebody from my alma mater, UW Oshkosh.
That's right. I forgot to mention Dan Shafer graduated from UW Oshkosh with political science and journalism degrees, right?
Political science and journalism, December 2008. A great time to graduate with a degree
Eh,
in journalism, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, right when we headed into the recession. I
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
remember reading your columns back when you were writing for the Advanced Titan at UW Oshkosh, and you were a very thoughtful undergraduate, which was
Those are
great. So
good
I was not,
times.
yeah, so
The
I was,
best practice I had in journalism was writing those columns at the Advanced Titan.
that's amazing. And so when I started seeing your work, not just with recombobulation, but you've written for the New York Times, the Daily Beast, I mean, numerous other sources. We're very proud here at UW Oshkosh of Dan Shafer, but you were doing freelancing, and then you started recombobulation in 2019, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what was
Yes.
the reason for starting it?
Yeah, so I had been, basically I had been a working journalist for in and around the city of Milwaukee for most of the 2010s. I worked at a place called Biz Times Milwaukee. I was at Milwaukee Magazine for several years. I was at the Milwaukee Business Journal, and then I eventually moved to Seattle and took a job out there as the digital managing editor of Seattle Magazine and Seattle Business Magazine. Ended up only being there for a year and moving back to Milwaukee, and then at which time I started doing some freelancing, started working with some of the other places that I used to work for, and then after a while I was just like, well, I kind of want to start something of my own. I kind of want to, instead of chasing these freelance checks and trying something else, and I think the I had always wanted to get back to kind of what you had mentioned there when I was a columnist at UW Oshkosh. I'd been a reporter and feature writer for Milwaukee Magazine and the other places I'd mentioned, but I really wanted to get back to writing something with a voice, with an opinion,
Yeah.
because that's really what drew me to writing writing in journalism in the first place. And so, given the kind of as things were going in the first Trump term, had a lot of thoughts, had a lot to say, and so I started the Recombobulation Area in late July of 2019. And I was a stay-at-home dad at the time, so I was
Right.
doing this, just kind of as my side gig while I was taking care of my daughter. So writing columns while my daughter was napping, um,
Wow.
and really, it started it with kind of an initial focus on, not just Milwaukee, not just Wisconsin, but I wanted to have kind of an eye on the larger Midwest.
Yeah.
The Midwest was so central to Trump's win in 2016 and was, just really key to understanding the changing political dynamics in the country at the time. I wanted to look at things from a regional perspective. But as I kind of continued writing that column, recognizing where the landscape was in Wisconsin and Milwaukee's media landscape, the opinion writing, especially like for those of us left of center, that was changing pretty significantly. So, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel had gotten rid of its opinion section and changed it
Yeah.
to the Ideas Lab. They run they have columnists and things like that, but it wasn't like a dedicated opinion space anymore.
Right.
And a lot of the other Milwaukee publications, many of which I'd worked for, were pivoting away from like a real political newsy type of focus for a lot of what they were doing. So, a lot of just kind of talking about like things going on in Milwaukee or dining or
Hmm.
events or concerts or whatever it might be. And I felt like there was this lane missing where there was some sort of like left of center media in Milwaukee
Right.
really talking about, just having commentary on big issues and things like that. And so as I started writing the regional stuff that I wrote kind of went nowhere. And then the state and local stuff that I wrote, that started getting picked up. That got some attention.
Yeah.
People maybe recognized my byline from Milwaukee Magazine or wherever it was that I had worked previously, social media following, whatever it might be. And so, yeah, I started that in late 2019 while I was a stay-at-home dad, and then 2020 I was really a stay-at-home dad during the
Right.
pandemic.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Um,
right.
and so, grew my readership from there. And then eventually it became my full-time job, and formed an LLC in 2022 with it. Got some childcare for my youngest,
Amazing.
and then kind of built it from there. And then last year, in August of 2024, the Civic Media, the growing radio and digital news network in Wisconsin, acquired the Recombobulation area and made me their political editor. So it's
Excellent.
been quite the time to be to take on a new
Yeah.
role in Wisconsin media and all of that during that time. But that's at least the short version of
Yeah.
how we got here for the Recombobulation area.
What do you see as the role of the kind of independent journalism that you do? I mean, do you see yourself, or independent opinion, right, whatever you want to call it? Do you see it as like a complement to the mainstream press? Do you challenge the mainstream press? How do you frame what you're doing?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think there is, I have so much respect for people who are in, traditional media, especially print media, because that's,
Yeah.
the printer, I guess, text media in the digital age.
Yeah.
But I have so much respect for the reporters and who are doing that work. But it's shrinking, right? The traditional media landscape, whether it's newspapers, radio, TV, it's just a shrinking amount of people, fewer and fewer people covering news and politics in Wisconsin every year. So I think independent media is really important for one, filling some of those gaps,
Yeah.
but also, challenging some of what, and covering things that maybe the traditional media wouldn't spend some time and focus on. One of the big projects that I did kind of in the earlier days of the recombobulation area was I did this really big multi-part feature in-depth story on the proposed expansion of the highway here in Milwaukee,
Right.
which, was talked about as there were different steps in the process, and Evers proposed it and the legislature approved it and whatever. But it wasn't really getting the type of in-depth look that I felt was really needed for a project like
Exactly.
$1.5 billion project.
Right.
So I really dug in on that. So I think there are opportunities to augment what traditional media is doing. There are opportunities to do things that traditional media doesn't. And I think as recently has been the case, I will stir the pot and rock the boat a little bit and criticize folks on both sides of the aisle.
When I tell people to subscribe to the recombobulation area, and they ask me what you're all about, I say Dan is like a millennial generation version of John Nichols and Bruce Murphy. And I love both of those guys, by the way.
Great writers, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Great writers. Do you see yourself as kind of like doing what, Nichols been with the Cap Times and the Nation for many decades now. Bruce Murphy, hard-hitting journalist, opinion writer for, I guess, Milwaukee Magazine for a long time, right?
He was there right before I started. Yeah. Now
Yeah,
at Urban Milwaukee. But yeah, I think that, I think a lot of what I want to do with it is keep it in the vein of that kind of like weekly newspaper columnist, well, in the
yeah,
tradition of that weekly columnist that you come to for commentary on what's happening on the state and local level. And I think because of just the way the media environment has changed, some people will find my work through social media, particularly
right,
on Twitter, where I have a fairly significant following, but also just like stuff on, radio appearances or kind of the just video clips and reels and whatever it might be. So it's really kind of a 2020s version
right.
of what the traditional newspaper columnist really brought to the larger landscape, where it is, yes, it is, commentary, weekly commentary on what's going on in the news, but it will occasionally do some deep dives and some real reporting and things like that too, and bring that part of my background, into the fold. There's no real rules for what this can or should be.
Right.
So it's kind of, I'm making it up a lot on my own, and nobody's asking me to do certain things that I do. Like I write for the last three news or election cycles now, I've written a preview of every race on the ballot in the Wisconsin state legislature.
You
That
know,
is 115 races every other
you,
year.
when
So
let me
yeah,
just tell you, Dan, when I first started getting into your work seriously, It was in 2022. My wife, Lori, who I think you've talked to, she was running for state assembly, and I'm looking at all the media coverage, and you were the only person doing deep dives into all the districts, right? And the
Yeah.
one thing I found that invaluable, by the way, when you do that kind of reporting. And one thing I especially appreciate about what you do is you don't seem to feel under any pressure to engage in what I call both sidesism, right? Which I
Mm-hmm.
think has been something that's been crippling the corporate press, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like they'll mention some awful thing that, say, the Republicans are doing, and then they have to find something awful the Democrats are doing,
Mm-hmm.
right? To kind of
Mm-hmm.
both sides it, even if they have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
Like, how
There
do
are
you
plenty
manage
of
to?
actual both sides arguments, and I think there is one in my most recent column on Tony Evers. But like, there are so many fake both sides
Right.
articles that are out there, and I think it is such this trap that traditional media gets into of just this is the framework of how things had been done, and this is how we're going to continue to do it, even as the larger landscape is changing, even as the nature of what a both sides argument really even is changing. So I think I think there is some unwillingness or reluctance to adapt to a changing media, and I yeah, you're right. I don't like to get into those both sides
Right.
nonsense.
It's nonsense, right? And you've worked in the corporate press. I'm sure you've worked with many editors. I mean,
Hmm.
do you do the editors put pressure on writers to engage in this kind of like fake balance? Or are the
I
journalists doing it on their own? Is it like I could see a scenario where a journalist like yourself, for example, wants to maintain his ability to be able to speak to all the politicians, whatever side of the aisle they're on, and so therefore you calculate, I better find a way to both sides of this at least mildly. I mean, did the editors enforce that kind of thing, or did the reporters do it on their own?
I mean it is it's from a reporting standpoint. So like when I was at Milwaukee Magazine, it was a little bit different because it was like it was a, like a more of a feature style writing and more of, I had a little bit of leeway to kind of move in my own circles and whatnot. And, when I was at the Milwaukee Business Journal, I wouldn't say it was like pressure or anything from the editors, but it's just like it's a formulaic way of reporting certain stories, of talking about certain things. And it's just like,
Right.
like, okay, this thing happened. Let's get a quote from a Republican and let's get a quote from a Democrat in the story about this big news in Milwaukee or whatever it might be, right? So I don't like to get into that necessarily get into that trap of that really formulaic style. I think, we can be creative as journalists, even in traditional spaces, where you don't have to go to this like rigid way of doing things just because it was the way of doing things previously. I think you
E-
just have to evolve and adapt and try new things and do things differently.
Exactly. Another thing I like about what you do is you do a lot of, I'll call it in the field reporting, where you actually go out and report on the story while it's taking place. So a good recent example of that was you went to the Wisconsin Democratic Party convention. I guess it was in Wisconsin Dells
That's right. Yeah. The Chula
recently,
Vista
and
Resort in Wisconsin
yeah,
Dells.
yeah, those working class Dems at the Chula Vista Resort, right? So while they were there, I guess the big story was Ben Wickler, who's gotten a lot of national praise and praise in the state. He announced he was stepping down. He ran for the Democratic National Committee chair, didn't get that. The guy from Minnesota got it. Um, let's start off like what is your take on Wickler? I mean, do you think he deserves all the praise that he's gotten?
It is maybe a little bit outsized, all things considered, but I do think he's just been such an impactful chair for the Democratic Party in Wisconsin. It's such an important time. Like he came in it in 2019, and I think the 6 years that he's been chair, really has transformed the party. I mean, this is kind of coming off the heels of the blue wave election in 2018, and Tony Evers beating Scott Walker and state Tony, Tammy Baldwin winning by 10. Like it was a big year for Democrats, but in order to be able to sustain that, to have the state go blue in the 2020 election, I think he has really transformed the party in a lot of ways, and I think, um, the convention weekend, last weekend or whatever it was now, um, it really was the Ben Wickler show, and
Yeah.
he was on. I lost count of how many times he took the stage. He, gave a speech of his own, a fairly long one, all things considered. He joined Tammy Baldwin on stage to do kind of like this in conversation thing instead of just like a traditional speech. He presided over, the election for the next chair the next day. He was like the guy nominating his potential successor, who did end up winning, Devin Remiker. So I do think he has really transformed the party. There may be some things that people might quibble with, but like on a big picture sense, I think he's really done a tremendous job. And I would not be surprised to at some point see him run for statewide office. That is
Wow.
something
Well,
I
he's
was,
got the personality for it, right? I've met him. He shows
yeah.
up, he smiles a lot, he's smart, he's got a great stump speech. I guess one of the quibbles would be the Dems really did not make any gains in rural Wisconsin. I mean, they can try and spin it however they want, but since Trump got in 16, it's been a steady downhill slide for Dems in the rural states. And I think even with the court decision that ended some of the most extreme gerrymandering, Dems still have problems in those rural areas. Do you think more could have been done, or what should? I mean, you don't provide free advice to the Democratic Party, but what's going
If they
on?
take it
Why?
anyway.
Yeah, if
Yeah,
they'll take it, right? Why have they been on this downhill slide with rural voters?
well, I think there's a number of things. For one, I do think you have to give Wickler and Wisconsin Democrats some credit here. Tammy Baldwin, Tony Evers, like, in not losing as much
Yeah,
as some other states have in rural areas. Because if you look at the demographic trends of Wisconsin, Wisconsin has a lot of the, non-college educated white voters who have trended towards Trump, and not necessarily even trended Republican, trended towards Trump in particular.
exactly.
And I think, the fact that Wisconsin hasn't gone the way of Ohio or Iowa or, some of these other states that demographics that are more similar to Wisconsin have gone, I think is some credit to the party. They don't lose by as much
Yeah.
in some of those rural areas. I think Baldwin in particular has been pretty strong with that. In Western Wisconsin, she ran ahead of the top of the ticket
Hmm.
in a number of key counties and I think much of the third congressional district in Western Wisconsin. But I also think there is, this divide that I think began in the Obama years, particularly around education. And I think education has been a huge differentiator for the kind of realignment that we're seeing in our politics. And I think you have, as Democrats have been losing in more rural areas, particularly rural areas where there are not that many people with college degrees, they are continuing to do better in areas that are more highly educated. So, like, I'm
Exactly.
in Milwaukee County too. A couple of the Milwaukee County suburbs that have like highly educated populations have just zoomed to the left. So you have like places like Whitefish Bay or Wauwatosa or even Brookfield to a certain extent in eastern Waukesha County now that has really become like blue cities. So like Wauwatosa in 2012 was a 50-50 city. That's kind of inner ring western suburb just on the border of Milwaukee. That was a 50-50 city when it was Mitt Romney versus
Mhm.
Barack Obama. I think last year when with Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, I think it was like a 70-30 split in Wauwatosa. And those are pretty populated areas. Similar stories can be said in kind of the North Shore suburbs, a slightly less so, but still shifting in the southern suburbs around Milwaukee too. You're seeing that in Dane County. And then I think you're also seeing that in some more highly educated parts of the Fox Valley too. You have Appleton
Yes.
and Green Bay and Oshkosh that, as we saw a lot of the country shift to the right in the last presidential election, I think the fact that like you had Oshkosh, Appleton kind of hold in place where it was, signified that that shift is still unfolding there. Whereas, I think in 2016, when it went from Obama to Clinton, that shift was pretty rapid in those cities, and now that
Right.
has slowed down a bit. So I think
So
that
how
is
did the how
interesting
did the
too.
right, how did the Dems become toxic to so many people without college degrees? I mean, is it the culture war issues? Is it the guns? Is it the immigration? Is it the trans rights? I mean, what's going on that has made because people without college degrees, I mean, that was part of FDR's New Deal coalition, right? And which they held on to for many, many years. I'm old enough to remember this. So how in your judgment, how did the Dems get that group back?
I think they need to really recommit to being the party of the working class. And I
Yeah.
think they have to, I think we're seeing like Trump won the working class
Yep.
in the 2024 election. And I think really, kicked out some tent poles in the Democrats' big tent. And it is collapsing in on itself in certain ways. So I think you have to really recommit to some policies around the working class and not just be kind of these like squishy centrist policies with it. Like you have to stand for something at the end of the day. And I think Democrats, I of course agree with them more often than the Republicans for sure. But I think you got to say that, like, for one example, I think Democrats should just come out all the way and say, hey, we're for universal health care. We're not
Exactly.
for like some sort of halfway, say like, okay, we did the Obamacare thing 15 years ago. Now it's time to take the next step and go to universal health care.
Yep.
And I think there are some other, things like that. And I think you mentioned immigration. I think the Democrats have done such a terrible job on the issue of immigration because so
Agree.
often I don't even know what they stand for when it comes to immigration. Like, what is their policy? I don't think Obama was a particularly good president on immigration. I think Biden's policies were just all over the place and had no coherent vision to any of it. And Trump is, I think his policies 10 years ago when he was talking about immigration were super toxic, but I think that's an issue he's winning on now. Like in the
Yeah.
2024 election, he even said that it was immigration and not the economy that he prioritized as his number one issue in the campaign. And I just think Democrats have had nothing to counter it. And so I think, until they find what exactly their footing is on that issue, which is one of, I think, the top three issues in the country right now, they're just going to keep getting clobbered on it. And I think
I agree.
I think they need to have something that they stand for because I think one of their messages last year was, oh, we want to pass this tough immigration and border enforcement bill, but Trump won't let us. But I thought that was just the worst possible message. It's just like this, oh, we're the real border tough on the border guys, but Trump isn't letting us. It's just like a position of weakness, and
Yeah,
it's
when they
just
make the
playing into
argument,
Republican arguments so much.
yeah,
So
when they make the argument that politicians are being politicians, that's not like the strongest argument. But, I'm sure speaking of 2024, I'm sure you were one of the people, and I was one also, who believed that Joe Biden should never have run in the first place, right? He should have removed himself, right? He didn't. He got in there, right? All kinds of reporting that he was, enabled, blah, blah, blah. We know the story. But to make the connection to Wisconsin, you're now shaking up the Democratic Party establishment in the state by arguing that Tony Evers, our governor here in Wisconsin, who is 73 years old, and I guess will be 75 for the next, oh no, 74, I guess, for the next election next year, right?
he'll turn 75 2 days after the election. I
All
learned
right.
this
So,
because Evers and I have the same birthday.
all right. But you are right. But you are making the argument, and I've heard you make it, or I've read you make it in print, and I've heard you make it on radio that Evers should not run, that there should be a competitive primary. So, first of all, what is your reasoning behind that?
Yeah, I think, it is the argument that I'm making that Tony Evers should not run for a third term is not an especially ideological one. It's not one I have major policy differences with him on. There are some things here and there, but like by and large, I think Tony Evers has been done a good job as governor. He's served the state well. But I just think it is incumbent on leaders in the Democratic Party looking at all of the things that has happened to the party in recent years and with recognizing that they need to pass the torch. This party of running people in their 70s and 80s over and over again, I think it is just so clearly not working. And if you look back to what happened in the 2024 election, I think Joe Biden, his decision to run again, and then having the worst debate performance in the history of debate performances,
Yeah,
uh, just put the Democrats in such a hole to dig out of. And I think, to whatever extent you think Kamala Harris did a good job on the campaign, I happen to think she did pretty good, all things considered. But they were in such a big hole. I think if Joe Biden would have stayed on the ticket, you'd have seen Trump win like Minnesota and Virginia and New Hampshire and some of that next wave of blue states. And en route to an absolute electoral wipeout. And I think, that would have probably would have meant Tammy Baldwin would have lost. Probably would have meant, a number of other Senate races would have gone the other direction too. And so I think Democrats have to confront this issue with their inability to pass the torch and constantly running these older candidates. And, I think the Evers Biden comparison is not a one-to-one perfect comparison
no,
or anything like that. Joe
no,
Biden was especially unpopular. Evers is a fairly popular purple state governor. He's almost a decade younger. He has not shown, signs of like the type of decline that we saw in Joe Biden. I mean, he looks like he's a 73-year-old guy, right? Like,
right.
but we should not be expecting candidates to run well into their 70s and 80s. There's a reason this is generally regarded as retirement age. And one of the examples that I used in the piece to illustrate this was the example of Herb Kohl. Herb Kohl announced in May 2011 that he would be retiring and not seeking another term in the Senate. He was 76 years old at the time, but also this is a time that Democrats are just coming off an absolute wipeout
Right.
in the 2010 midterms, and that seat was far from a sure thing. And so, opening up that primary that Tammy Baldwin eventually won and eventually won the race, a tough race against like a well-liked former governor in Tommy Thompson, like
Yeah,
the passing of the torch worked in that sense.
right.
So does Tony Evers want his legacy to be more like Herb Kohl, who got to pass the torch to Tammy Baldwin, who's now in her third term in the U.S. Senate, or does he want to spend it like Joe Biden and
No, I hear
answer
what you're
questions
saying. I
about his mental acuity and whether he should
Yeah.
have ran again and all of these different things? And I think it really creates a whole lot of problems for the Democratic Party at large in Wisconsin if Evers does decide to run again.
No, I hear you, and I agree with you on Evers. I think he's been a good governor. I'd like to see him be a little bit more assertive slash aggressive with the Republicans who've obstructed his agenda at every turn. But I understand the politics. So overall, I think he's done a good job. But I agree with you that I work as a college professor, and one thing that has really shocked me over the last 10 years is how the Republican Party is making so many more inroads among young voters. I never in my life did I ever think I would see the Democrats perceived as the kind of elder party. And yet that's been going on, right? And so, and it leads me to the question, has anyone in an official capacity gotten behind your call? Like I saw, for example, that Mark Pocan, very liberal congressman out of Madison, good guy. He immediately came out and said, "I'm supporting Tony Evers."
Hmm.
Right. And I think Mark in some ways can be a bellwether for like the left of center in Wisconsin. Do you think they're all just going to line up behind Evers just like they all lined up behind Biden in 2024?
I think it's pretty like if he runs again, if he says he's going to run again, which he said he will announce after the state budget process is
Right.
complete, and that's a whole separate conversation. It's not going to be complete, probably on time this year. But I do think there is, if Evers runs again, I don't expect many people would, many, if anyone, would challenge him in the primary. But I do think that the part of the reason I wanted to write this piece now is because that decision is still pending, and I think,
Yeah.
having spent some time with a lot of Democrats at the Chula Vista Resort in Wisconsin Dells a couple of weeks ago here, I think there is a lot more openness to having somebody else at the top of the ticket than people might be saying publicly right now.
I
Um,
mean, I was really glad that you wrote it because again, like I said, I like Tony, good guy. I think one of the better governors in the state right now, or in the United States right now. But the discussion does need to be had, especially given what they experienced in 2024 at the presidential level. Having said all of that, are there certain people that you think on the Democrat side that would be good governor candidates? I mean, I'm sure some of the people like Kelda Roys in the Senate would probably get in, Sarah Godlewski, maybe the Attorney General, Josh Kaul, right? You know, people that have some kind of name recognition. Are those the kind of names that you think would be likely?
Yeah, definitely. I think, this is part of the argument too, is that I think Democrats have a fairly strong bench right now in Wisconsin. I don't think that necessarily would have been the case, and think back to like 2014 when there was not a lot of competition and Mary Burke was the candidate against Scott Walker and lost pretty
Yeah.
big. I think Democrats have a good bench right now, and I think, yeah, you mentioned some of them: Attorney General Josh Kaul, um, Secretary of State Sarah Godlewski, Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez, um, Kelda Roys, State Senator Kelda Roys, and Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley is somebody I've interviewed on a couple different occasions being
Yeah.
here, and he is definitely interested in running if Evers does not run. And then Ben Wickler also,
Right.
I don't know if he would turn right around and run for
Who
governor, but
who is part of that deep bench in your judgment that is not perceived as a Madison or Milwaukee liberal, right? Because I know that Sarah Godlewski likes to talk about her Eau Claire roots, and
mhm.
many of the people that you mentioned always like to talk about their roots in other part of the state. But I think now they are largely perceived as Milwaukee slash Madison types of liberals. Are there candidates like I think what part of Tony Evers' appeal, for example, back in 2018, is that I think he genuinely was not perceived as a Madison area a liberal,
Mhm.
right? Do the Dems have someone like that that you can think of, or who would be credible in a non-Madison, non-Milwaukee type of framing?
Sure. I think a lot of these candidates would have messages that would translate beyond, Madison or Milwaukee and
Hmm.
all of that too. I do think it would probably be good to have a number of candidates from around the state. I think um, but I also think like there's people like Rebecca Cook, for example, in the third congressional district. Like she's going to be running in a competitive race to try and flip that uh, congressional seat.
Right.
Whereas, I think a number of those types of races, you got to build the bench back up in places like the Fox Valley or
Yeah.
Western Wisconsin, right, where they have had some losses in recent years. So I think that needs to get built back up. But I think overall, um, I think it's a pretty strong group, and I think you could even probably pick a few more names from around the state too. But I don't think that is necessarily a full-on hindrance the way that it may
Yeah.
have even been when Evers ran or something like that too. I think a lot of these candidates can really have statewide appeal. I mean, Josh Collins won two statewide races. I think, I mean, David Crowley is somebody that I think has an absolute ton of potential. And he's just like a really remarkable retail politician. So I think be the
Yeah.
type of guy you get him on the campaign trail. He's talking to people, he's smiling, he's laughing, he's having a good time, and I think that would resonate too.
Dan, I know I've taken up way too much of your time. In closing here, how can people find out more about the recombobulation area?
Yeah, so you can of course subscribe to the Recombobulation Area. It's on Substack. You can be a free subscriber and just get the emails sent to your inbox, or become a paid subscriber and get a few more things. So we do some giveaways or whatever for people who are paid subscribers, and sometimes we have some stuff behind the paywall. And then I'm also a part of Civic Media now, so you can hear me on the airwaves, across the state. I think we've got 26 radio
Yeah.
stations across the state now, somewhere between 10 and 15 that are of the news and political variety. But I'm on many of those shows regularly. I'm working with a lot of our team on Civic Media to try and do all sorts of different things. So best place to and then I'm also, for those who are still there, on twitter.com. So if Robin Voss hasn't done enough to make me leave the state of Wisconsin, then Elon Musk hasn't done enough to get me to leave Twitter. So I'm still there, and you can find me there as well.
All right, cool. And hey, if you guys need a Fox Valley pundit on civic media every now and then, you know who to call.
Sounds
So,
great.
All right. Thanks, Dan. I hope you can do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye bye.